So, Alex, it's an honor to have you on my podcast. So, for those who doesn't know you yet, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, Eric, first of all, thank you so much for having me, man. I always enjoy, doing these things and connecting with people all over the world. To me, it's really cool that, we're able to communicate from Canada to Taiwan. So that's amazing. So just a little bit about me. I'm an exercise physiologist, strength conditioning coach outside of Toronto, Canada. Um, During COVID, my business really transitioned into more into more of the educational component of things. So when before COVID, I was doing just one-on-one working with clients, primarily people who came to me starting in pain, and then we worked through it, and then they stayed with me from a training. But really, what I focused on was, or a lot of people will come to me in pain first, and to me that was a little bit more exciting than just the training aspect. And it may not be the most popular answer, but if you understand pain and the complexities of movement, it makes it a little more fun in order to put things together. So now what I can do is I can train people and select exercises that are more specific than just randomly picking exercises. So what I did during COVID was I started my education wing to my company, Resilient Education, where I basically, for the first few months of COVID, I wrote down my entire model and the way that I think about things. And I put it down. And what I was doing is I was presenting it on different mentorships, like mentorship on like Katie St. Clair. Like that was a big one where she had me on quite often. And what I would do is I would present my thoughts on exercise selection, and she just said, as well as my wife said, "Hey, why don't you create your own course, because you're obviously passionate about it." So that's what I did. I created Evolve Biomechanics Mentorship, and every single time I've run it since June 2020, I've changed it. We finally just re-recorded it with like a nice camera, because before it was like a Zoom call where I was a little box in the top right corner, but now it looks a little bit more professionally done, and I broke it down in different modules, updated the content, and so I've been running that. I've been consulting with people all over the world, from trainers, therapists, working in professional organizations, um, like baseball and hockey and even NCAA Division 1 teams. And yeah, and so now I'm here talking to you. And I guess the only other thing that I would say is, with this, what I try to do is really bridge the gap between what rehabilitation and what training is. And because I don't think that there is as big of a gap as people believe it to be. With that being said, of course, like, some people shouldn't, based on their scope of practice, they shouldn't be doing certain things. With that being said, understanding more and more about exercise selection and how the body moves and your assessment process is just going to make it, you're going to be able to get better answers or better results quickly or faster with your clients. And so, yeah, I would say that that kind of sums up a little bit about me.
Cool. I think I think for like our industry, co when COVID happened, it's kind of like pushes us to like go online. So there's like a lot of like strength coaches, a lot of like physio. They had to go online. And
Yeah.
it somehow like changes our way to approach clients or our way to approach the world.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because before COVID, I never posted on Instagram. I actually did not like Instagram. I was barely on it. I mean, what I would do is I would use it as a way to like network with certain people. Like I'd be talking to a lot of people and just seeing, what people were doing, but I did not post. I mean, I started with like 300 followers or something, and they're all family and friends. Like that's what it was. I wasn't posting anything of significance. And, as I said, for me, like what I had done is I went to business for myself in 2019, beginning of 2019, where I was just working with clients And so COVID really rocked my business. I mean, I went from having, a decent income with consistent clients to zero. I was making nothing. Just a couple clients stayed on with me virtually. And so the thought of going virtual and online was so far removed from what, I thought what I would actually do. That being said, when I started to, when COVID happened, I had so much free time. I'm like, I can't just sit on the couch watching Netflix. I have to do something. And so that's what I did. I was spending 10, 11, 12 hours just like thinking about what I could do. And then, putting my information on a piece of paper and then started posting because I was just like, you know what? I'm going to start to, for me, it was like, I've got so many more eyes on me now, or I have the ability to capture so many more eyes because people are at home doing nothing. They're going to be sitting on their phone, glued to their phone, just trying to find something to do. And so for me, it was like, how could I be productive and, share something that I thought may be valuable and that's helped me with my clients. And so yeah, so I started posting, but you're absolutely right. I think the biggest transition during COVID is realizing that the geographical borders are not there. I mean, I could never picture, me speaking to someone in Taiwan or having clients who are in China, all over Europe, right? So it's really reduced the barrier to entry when it comes to not just, working with people, but from training or rehab standpoint, but also, from the education standpoint. I mean, in Canada, we don't have much education. We don't have a lot of people coming to Canada for to teach courses and stuff like that. So I would always have to fly to the States, or the courses would be in Europe or something like that. But now, you know, I saw that as another thing that was growing, and that's really what I wanted to do was provide a resource for trainers, therapists, or other movement professionals to be able to start to put together different principles from a course perspective, or different ways of thinking from a movement perspective that again that's helped me in the past, so I can maybe skip steps. And so I just saw that this education wave was coming because again, like, people are at home doing nothing and people aren't out doing things, and so they have the time to actually take the time to invest in themselves and from an education standpoint. And so yeah, absolutely, I think it's been a big change, and I think it's here to stay. With that being said, I don't think it's going to be the majority of certain people's businesses. I mean, some for sure, but I know other people who were online people before COVID, and then that forced them to stay online, but now they're like, hey, like, I actually value working in person, so I want to step away from online a little bit. But for me, I love it. I would say it used to be 100% of my business was in person. Now I would say 20% of my business is in person, and I like it that way.
Cool. So it sounds like turnout's great, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Love
No,
that.
it's
Love that.
it's it's great. I mean, the we've had a lot of growth, but it's come from a lot of different testing and different types of innovation, and really trying to change the way that the message is provided. Because look, you can have the best message out there with that, but if it's not packaged well, no one's going to look at it. No one's going to, it's just not going to resonate with people. And so what I try to do is, a lot of my content comes from my clients and them asking me questions and be like, hey, why am I doing this? Why is this helping? And just my thought process on how I can address this complex situation, but make it simpler to understand, because there's a lot of, like, the body's super complex, and breaking it down into these principles or way of thinking just helps from a decision standpoint.
Love that. Love that. Love that, man. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I'm gonna jump into the question list I sent it to you, okay?
Yep.
Cool. So these questions are based on the post of your Instagram. So,
Yeah.
and the
Okay.
first one is, I think it is really interesting, and I don't think I ever asked a coach before. So can you like explain it to us? How does like the gait cycle work? And I noticed that you divide it into like different phases. So can it kind of explain it to us?
Yeah, for sure. So just to gain some context, when I was taking a bunch of these different courses or even trying to figure out how I could understand what the assessment was telling me as well as what exercise to pick, I was trying to distill everything down into some fundamental principles. So every course that's out there, they all kind of had a different way of saying things, but underlying the course were these principles. And the two main ones were, gait as well as some type of respiration and how those two principles influenced everything. And so, from a movement standpoint, right? So, well, there are two things that we need to do in order to survive, and that's breathe and move. And so, if we don't, then we're probably going to die because as we start to not move, become more sedentary, and things start to break down. So, what I wanted to do is categorize everything into those different principles. And so, gait was one of them. Now, if you think about gait and what gait is just a forward propulsion of movement, is a forward progression of movement. It's used to get around. And so with each different phase of gait, there are different forces that are acted on the body. There's different movement requirements. There's different the way that the bones move, the way they absorb force, the way that the muscles contract, as well as absorb force, and how we manage both ground reaction forces and center of gravity. And so there's three primary phases that you will see in most textbooks and most education online. I like to break down to four, but the three primary ones are heel strike, mid stance, and toe off. Now, the reason why I say four is because mid stance is the longest duration. And so I like to divide it into two different phases. That is early mid stance and late mid stance. So heel strike is essentially what is as it sounds. It's the initial contact with the ground. So your heel is hitting the ground and your foot is dorsiflexed. So the toes are pointed up to the ceiling and they're slowly being descended down through muscles like our calves and our soleus. Now, when that happens, that's when our center of gravity is behind our foot. And so to me, this area is where we have maximal range of motion because we don't have a lot of gravity acting on us. Ground reaction forces are minimal because they're kind of pushing our center of gravity back. Like the more our center of gravity goes back towards our heels, the more range of motion we unlock, the more forward towards our toes, the more we get stiff. And so we got this heel strike where the heel hits the ground. And then early mid stance is when our met head, like the balls of the big toe or the balls of the toes, are contacting the ground and our shin is starting to move forward. So the best way to think of it is I'm starting the starting position of a split squat with the front foot forward. Okay. Now, this is when my center of gravity starts to go underneath me a little bit. And in this phase, this is where there's primarily internal rotation and pronation. So from the foot to the knee to the hip, all the way up the chain, that's where there's internal rotation that's being created. So if you have somebody who's like, okay, I have limited internal rotation of the hip, likely they're probably missing the ability to pronate the foot, internally rotate the shin, and internally rotate the hip, or they're lacking this mid stance phase. And so once I get to this early mid stance, this is when I start to improve internal rotation. When I get to late mid stance, that is when the foot is directly underneath me or slightly in front. So think of like when you're doing a step up and you're at the end of a step up. So you got your right leg on the box and it's pressing to the ground. It starts to straighten as the left knee marches up. That hip extension where the foot is underneath the pelvis, this is our late mid stance. And the reason why I differentiate that between toe off is because toe off is when our heel lifts off the ground, and where all of our center of gravity is on the toes that are propelling me to the other side. So it's heel strike, my heel hits the ground. Early mid stance is when my balls of my toes hit the ground and my shin starts to move forward. Now my center of gravity is starting to move forward. This is why my talus and my foot will unlock, and that will allow for pronation or the arch to go down, which is kind of like the beginning of a split squat. Then as I go to late IR, that's where hip extension starts to happen. So this is where the force is directly underneath me. So now my center of gravity is kind of coming down more closer towards the ground. And then I go to toe off, which is where I'm maximally producing force to push me off. And so when we see people from an assessment standpoint who are super stiff and they have their feet dumping inwards and they just don't have a lot of range of motion, the way that I categorize it is these people are more into this toe off because they don't have the ability to shift their weight back into their heels. Everything is being shoved forward. And so our goal is to bring them back towards their heel in a progressive manner. I can't just get them back to their heel. I may have to do certain things in order to unlock the ability to shift their center of gravity back. Because if I'm in toe off, think of like somebody who, is maybe like a sway back. Maybe they're arching their lower back. They're squeezing their shoulder blades together. Their ribs are flared. Their femurs are just turned out. Their feet are turning out. So everything is just being smushed together, right? And so our goal is to reduce tension through manipulating our center of gravity.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, how does let's say people like me, I have flat feet. How does flat feet gonna affect our gait cycle, and how is it gonna affect the movement when we do squat, deadlift, or even when we sprint?
Yeah. So what I'll say is based on these phases of gaits, you can categorize different exercises, right? And so that was one thing I left out. But from a flat foot perspective, okay, so we have to differentiate between somebody's foot who's actually pronated. So they can actually get this pronation when their shin moves forward. So it's like this dynamic arch where as their shin comes back, their arch starts to lift up. As their shin goes forward, their arch comes down. That's just like a dynamic arch. And so that's different. Pronation is different than pronating. So when you're looking at somebody who just stands with flat feet, their tibias are turning out. So if you look at somebody's knee, you look at the kneecap, there's a little pointy bone sticking out underneath the kneecap. That's called your tibial tuberosity. And think of that as like an aimer as to what your tibia is doing. So if it's pointing outwards, that is telling us that the tibia is externally rotated, and it means we don't have the ability to internally rotate or pronate our foot. Okay. And so when you see these people with flat feet, it's not that their foot is pronated, because what you'll see is their tibias are turned out as their foot is dumped in. And so what you're looking at is somebody who actually has a supinated foot or a higher arch, but they need to be able to internally rotate or put force into the ground or absorb force. And so what they do is they just take their entire foot and they dump it inwards. And so that's where you see that flat foot. And sometimes you'll see like a bunion on the big toe, where essentially it's the big toe is kind of being pushed against the second toe for somebody who's been there for a long period of time, or their center of gravity is really forward. But you need to think that flat-footedness position doesn't have to do with the fact, it's not that they're in mid-stance. They don't have internal rotation of their hip. So they're compensating by dumping the foot in and arching their back. So if I can't internally rotate my hip, I'm going to arch my back. I'm going to shove my hips forward so that my hips are over my toes, so that the weight of my pelvis is pushing into the ground, and that's what's collapsing my feet. Right. So from that perspective, it's like you're getting, those people can't get off the ground. They're getting stuck on the ground. So if you're thinking about like a sports performance standpoint, and you see somebody like sprinting, the people with flat feet, they're losing their mechanical efficiency, because if I'm stuck into this foot that's dumped in, what I'm doing is I'm just shoving the pelvis forward as I'm running, versus being able to have this dynamic arch, which then allows me to get the stretch shortening cycle of like something like your Achilles tendon, and allow your muscles to absorb force or produce force at different times. Right? Because like the way that the gait cycle works, and like gait is not just walking, it's also running. There's just slightly different phases added in, like a flight phase, like you're in the air longer with running. Heel strike is a little bit different. But if you have this flat foot, you get stuck on the ground. You're on the ground for too long, which decreases your speed. And it also increases, it can increase the chance for more like soft tissue discomfort or injuries. And the reason is because I've got so much force going through these tissues that aren't in a position to absorb these forces. So what I would say is, if I've got somebody who's got flat feet, but they've got tibias that are turned out, I'm thinking to myself, they don't have hip internal rotation. They're faking it by pushing their whole center of gravity over their toes to try to get it. Because our body's going to find a way to do it. Body's going to find a way to compensate.
So, is there like any exercise to like correct this?
It's a good question. I get that question all the time. It's like, okay, what do you do about it now? Well, the first thing I would say, and I sound like a broken record because every time people ask me that, I'll always say the same thing. How you get, so the primary thing is to get your center of gravity back. The how is based on your assessment. Because let's say I took a measurement like a straight leg raise. And now the straight leg raise should, if you have max straight leg raises, around like 70 to 90 degrees. Okay. And you had 30 degrees on the left, which just means it's very limited. And you had 40 degrees on the right, which is also quite limited, but it's a little bit better. That tells me your pelvis is turned towards the right. You're turned towards the number that's greater. You're turned towards that 40 degrees. But because there's that limitation, you also have a lot of tension in the lower part of your hips. So like your glutes are stiff in that lower part of the pelvis. And so for me, what I'm thinking is, okay, I've got to bring your center of gravity back on both sides. I also, because I want to turn you to the left, because your pelvis is turned to the right, I got to eventually turn you back towards the left. I can't do that yet, because if I were to try to do that, you with flat feet don't have the ability to internally rotate the hip, which means you can't extend the hip. You are going to arch your back. You're going to do all these things to compensate. So my objective is to bring the center of gravity back, bring it back more on the right than the left for now, and then try to push you over towards the left. So I got to first regain more range of motion on that right side to then propel you to the left. Because if I turn your body towards the left, you're going to open up range of motion. And so the exercise is difficult for me. Now, okay, so we got to bring your center of gravity back. So how do we do that? We got to bring you back more towards your heels. We have to open up the space in between your shoulder blades. We have to open up the space in the lower part of the pelvis. So the easiest way to do that is to take you off your feet, because I want to unweight your body. Gravity is not your friend, clearly. As soon as you stand up, those gravity is trying to push you down the ground. So you're trying to kind of hold on, and as if you're like pushing on a barbell all the time, your feet dump in. So I've got to do something where I'm taking you off your feet. So maybe I'm getting you to lay on your back, Because if I lay you on your back, then everything's going towards the ground. And if I were to take away the ground, you would fall backwards, which essentially is what I want you to do. I want you to come back towards your heels. Well, I don't want you to have a leg or a hip that's extended. So I probably wouldn't be laying you down your back with your legs straight. So I got to bend your knees. Okay. Because I bend your knees, I reduce the amount of hip extension because you don't have it. Because a straight leg raise said you don't have hip extension. So I have my knees bent. So now I'm kind of like in a hook lying position where I'm on my back, knees are bent. Now I want to bring your center of gravity back more. So maybe I can lift your feet up. So now I've got you in a hook lying position and your feet are on top of a little 2-inch box maybe. Because if I do that, I passively roll your hips back because the more my knees are like the more my knees are higher than my hips, the more my pelvis will roll backwards. So now I've shifted your center of gravity back even more. And then maybe I do something like, I don't know, like a low reach or something. Because if I reach down low, what it's going to do, it's going to open up in between my shoulder blades. It's going to open up my lower rib cage. So there you go. You've got a feet elevated, hook lying, low reach exercise. Other exercises that can be good are rolling, like an arm bar or something like that, because the ground is going to reshape your pelvis. Like if you think of what internal rotation is at the pelvis, it's closing the top of the pelvis. And so what I could do is I can use the ground as a way to kind of smush the pelvis in, and then that could create internal rotation. So the how is difficult, but what I would say is these two things. One, we got to bring the center of gravity back. Two, if you have flat feet, your feet, we likely cannot use your feet that much because they're compensating. So what I mean is I probably can't stand you up right away. Or if I do, I have to do something like put your foot on a wedge or something, because that's going to shift your center of gravity back and that's going to unload your foot. But I got to find exercise that are going to bring my weight back into my heels.
Cool. Love that. Love that. So, the next topic I want to discuss is also from your Instagram, and it's about like when we do like there's a lot of like discussion a few years ago about like should the knee be caving in when we do things like squat or like things you mentioned for like lunges. So
Mm-hmm.
can you like explain to us what are your thoughts on like knee caving in?
Yeah. So during hip flexion, again, let's take a squat. If I'm going down to a squat, if ass to grass is 180 degrees of hip flexion, okay, we have different during that descent from 0 to 180, we have different things happening at the hip and at the pelvis. The hip is where the femur meets the pelvis, and then the pelvis is like, the hip bones that everyone sees, like those pointy parts, and the sacrum as well, like the ilium and the sacrum. Now, in the first 0 to 60, so I'm standing straight up at 0, the first 0 to 60, that's going to bias a little bit more external rotation initially, because I have to be able to flex my hips and unlock my hips to be able to go down. Internal rotation is propulsion. It's going to be more biased towards hinging movements. And so if I have a pelvis or pelvic floor that's really stiff, for example, I'm not going to be able to descend because I'm fighting against this wall of muscle tension. So the first 0 to 60, I have to relax my pelvic floor a little bit to allow that descent. So it's more external rotation of the hips and the pelvis. When I get to 60 degrees, this is when certain muscles start to change how they function. So the posterior glute med is an external rotator. The anterior glute med is an internal rotator when the hip is flexed. And that starts to kick on at around somewhere between 45 to 70 degrees of hip flexion. So now I've got an anterior glute med that is going to internally rotate my hip, And if you look at how it's attached, it is attached on the outside part of the ilium. So it's going to push the ilium in, which again is internal rotation. So I've got that. I've got the piriformis that will change its leverage to become an internal rotator. I've got my adductors and my got my adductors that will also become internal rotators, because what they'll do is they will grab on to the sit bones or the pubic area, and it will open it up, which is needed for ascension. Okay, so I've got all those things happening. I've got muscles changing leverage. So from 60 to 120 is really where this internal rotation of my hips happen. And then 120 to 180, in order for me to sit with my butt to my heels, right at the bottom of the squat, I need everything to essentially relax. And so that is going to allow for the more external rotation to happen, more lumbar flexion. But then as I stand up, it's as if I'm extending my hips. I'm pushing into the ground to stand up. So the ascension phase is a lot more force production and propelling. So that's going to require internal rotation. So the reason why I broke this down is because there's two different areas where we could be getting, or you see people with this knee caving in. One is as they're going down in between the 60 to 120. And two is when they're at the bottom of the squat and they start to push themselves up and their knees cave in. Okay, so and when they go down at that 60 to 120, if they do not have the ability to internally rotate their hips, that is something that you may see, is their knees caving in, because it goes back to what we talked about before. Their feet start to dump in and turn out, because I can't pronate my foot properly. So I'm going to turn my foot outwards because it gives me a better access into the inside of my foot. It's not the most efficient way of doing it, but it is a way to try to create internal rotation in my hips, because from 60 to 120, like if I didn't have internal rotation, I would just fall down in my squat. The internal rotation allows me to control my descent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cave my knees in to try to create that internal rotation effect at the hips, try to ascend the pelvic floor. But it's not the most effective way to do it, obviously, because we're not using the muscles that are supposed to be functioning then. We're not using our VMO. Instead, we're using our vastus lateralis, our outside quad. We're starting to use our inside calf instead of our outside calf, because our outside calf is an internal rotator. So all these things are happening on the descent. So that's one way, right? We're trying to absorb force, but we can't. The other way is when they're at the bottom of the squat and they need to stand up and you see their knees cave in right away. The best way to see this is a power lifter at the bottom of a squat or a clean or a snatch, whatever. As they push up, you'll see their knees cave in initially. And this is the same thing. They don't have the ability to extend their hips. So as I mentioned, we've got early mid stance and late mid stance. Early mid stance is descending into the squat. So if I don't have that, if I don't have the hips ability to internally rotate, my knees will cave in as I go down from that 60 to 120. If I don't have the ability to extend my hips, that's when you start to see the knees potentially caving in, because the lower back starts to arch. Because if I can't get the extension through my hips, I'm going to do it through my back. And so I shoot my pelvis forward, my knees then cave in, and then I'm pushing myself out. Are these a problem? Not necessarily, right? They may never cause pain. And from a powerlifting standpoint, it's probably needed. They need to be able to compensate in order to produce the massive amount of force that they need. If somebody's doing it in a body weight squat, it's likely that they can't control their center of gravity and they don't have the motion of the hips that we talked about, primarily this internal rotation. But then you hear these people say, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cue them to push their knees out, to spread the floor, to corkscrew their feet out, right? Try to twist your feet out, because what that's going to do is going to turn everything out. But like, that's how they got there in the first place. That's not addressing the issue. The issue is they don't have the ability to internally rotate their hips. So based on this logic, if we know that 60 to 120 is where we internally rotate, then maybe I can just get them to squat to 60 degrees or to 90 degrees. I get to do a box squat instead of them free falling, right? I don't need to put a band. Like, I could put a band around the knees, but I'm not cueing them to push out. I'm just cueing, hey, don't let your knees cave in, but don't push out. I want you to keep your knees in line with in between your fourth and your second toe. Don't let your knees move, because if that happens, if I'm able to hold that in place, then the movement of the femur, of the shin, of the foot, of the hip, that can all just do its thing as you're moving through it. Like, I'm a huge proponent on the concept of self-organization, where if I give the body certain constraints, like a box, like a ramp, holding a weight in front of them instead of behind them, then the body is going to organize itself to create the movement I'm looking for with minimal cueing, right? So knees caving in isn't bad. It's just important to understand what we are seeing and why it may be happening. And it's not about correcting, but it's about optimizing. We are trying to make sure that this person has all the available range of motion that they need in order to do what they're intending to do. If it's general population, they want to get fit. Well, we should be giving them the ability to express all range of motion, because they're not playing a sport or they're not doing something performance-based where we may need to lock up certain ranges of motion. They are just going about their day. They don't want to be hurt, and they want to move well and feel good. And so our goal is to understand what these motions are telling us, and then how can we modify exercises in order to restore the range of motion.
Cool. So since there's the problem is they probably won't have the range of motion of like the hip internally rotate. Why don't we just address this at the first place?
So, like, why don't we just address the hip internal rotation so that it doesn't happen?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say that a lot of people don't actually assess before they train people. And that's a big issue, in my opinion. You're just throwing, exercise at the wall and hopefully something sticks. Instead, if you can assess somebody, you can gain understanding of where they are in space. And I always say, like, hip internal rotation is not necessarily, I mean, it is, but I don't view it firstly as the hip's ability to internally rotate. I view it first as, where is the pelvis in space? Where is the body in space? If I start to lose internal rotation, that means that my hip is really far forward, or I'm arching my back, or my center of gravity is really far forward, right? I see my pelvis dumping over my femur. And so, to me, I think the first thing is to assess, to gain an understanding of where somebody is in space. And then secondly, based on the assessment, which is like your roadmap, you can still train people normally. You just modify it. It's like, if I've got somebody who, in the scenario we discussed, 40 degrees of straight leg raise on the right, 30 on the left, maybe their hip flexion is like in the 80s, right? Maybe what I do is I get them to do a heels elevated box squat to 70 degrees or 80 degrees, because 80 is their max. And if they go lower than 80, they're probably going to be compensating or doing something, right? So I can modify things that way. But yeah, I mean, if I were to get somebody who was like, yeah, like I've got, this range of motion, I don't have a lot of internal rotation in my hips. Like I'm going to expect to see certain things when I put them in certain movements. If I get them to do a split squat, it's going to look funky. I've seen enough split squats and assessed enough people to know that they're probably going to have a hard time getting into the split squat. They won't have the ability to extend their big toe. They're going to arch their back because they can't extend their hip. What they're going to do in the split squat is the same thing's going to happen as a squat. Is their knee's going to cave in, or their foot's going to turn out, their back leg's going to turn out. All these things are going to happen. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, if I want you to do a split squat, then maybe what I'm going to get you to do is a front foot elevated split squat. Okay, because what I've done is I've shifted your weight back onto the back foot a little bit, which now allows me to, shift my center of gravity back. It takes the weight off of the front leg. At the beginning, as I go down, I'm going to put more weight on the front leg, but initially it's going to unweight my body. And so it's going to help restore range of motion. Or I don't do a split squat to start. Maybe what I'll do is I'll do a step up, or I'll do a crossover step up because it doesn't require as much hip flexion. And then I can create this program based on the measurements being like, hey, you don't have 80 degrees of hip flexion. All right, well, let's stay within your 0 to 80 for now. Let's put the weight in front of you, not behind you, because you put the weight behind you, you're going to start to push your center of gravity towards your toes. If I bring it in front of you, you're going to shift back towards your heels. If I shift you more towards your heels, I'm going to unlock range of motion, right? And so I can start to create exercises based on what I'm seeing. And the way that I work is if I work with somebody, the first session is an assessment, and then I give them a few exercises to work on before our next session. And now those few exercises become part of their warm-up. It may be their only warm-up. And then I've created a program like heels elevated, box squat to 80 with holding cables, right? Or a goblet position. And then what I do is I do a high to low cable press, because pressing down low is going to open up my back. It's going to shift me back. They've got 80 degrees of hip flexion. They probably have somewhere around the same in shoulder flexion. So I'm not going to be doing overhead pressing. So I'm going to be doing stuff again below this 90-degree range. Maybe I'm doing a shoulder fly or whatever. You know what I mean? So I could do all these things. But again, the methods are a result of the principles, and the assessment should be based on principles of gait, of breathing, of physics, how gravity affects us, how ground reaction forces affect us, how the joints move, how they rotate, what happens inside the joints. Our joints are not hinge necessarily. Like they aren't. They're not connected. They're suspended in water. So that makes them more of a hydraulic system. So you can start talking about hydraulics and all that stuff, right? So you can start to understand how it's not just like everyone needs a squat, everyone needs a deadlift. It's like, well, how and why? And the more you ask themselves those questions, the more you can kind of get to the answer.
Yeah, I love that. Love that.
Mm-hmm.
So, so much for the lower body.
Yeah.
Last question before I let you go, okay?
Yeah.
So I want to discuss about like how you like view the thoracic spine mobility, and how to adjust that, because there's a lot of I think it's more. I think nowadays people probably most of the people have like neck pain or like shoulder pain, and there's like these people tend to like go see the doctor and do something like when they have like neck pain, they just like there's something in Taiwan. I don't know if there's anything like this in Canada, but it's like pulling the neck upward.
Yeah. It's like traction.
Yeah. Do you
track.
have that thing?
I don't I don't think I've ever there's a machine that I've seen where people go in and they do like pull on the
Yeah,
neck,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I've seen like around like on Instagram and stuff where people they put this like band around the neck and they pull it really
Yeah.
quickly to get a massive adjustment. Like I've seen that. I haven't seen that in Canada. Um, Probably does happen, but they don't post about it. I don't know. It does happen in the States. I've seen it in the States though.
But so uh I want to know about like your thoughts on like how to deal with neck pain and is thoracic spine part of it?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a pretty big question. Like I in my mentorship, I talk about it for weeks because of how like in depth you can go, but I'll just summarize it a little bit. You have different, let's talk about the spine first. With the spine, you have these things called facets. And so basically, if you look at what a vertebrae, or if you look at a picture of a vertebrae, you'll see these like uh, pointy things sticking out sideways. Okay. Right. So those transverse processes, or whatever, how you want to call it, each of like from C3, or sorry, C5 to C6, they create a joint called a facet. So these like little pointy things, they kind of connect together through cartilage and they allow each vertebrae to move relative to each other. Now, from C5 to about T4, T5, those facets are positioned in more of the transverse plane, and the transverse plane accounts for rotation. So this area of the spine is really more rotation based. Then as you go down, you'll start to see that they move into more of the frontal plane, so more side bending, and then they move forward into more of the sagittal plane, or move back into towards the sagittal plane. So from C5 to T5, they will move together. And so if I turn my neck towards the right, for example, what'll happen is I will open from C5, so the kind of like the lower part of my neck, my lower cervical spine, to kind of like my mid scapula in between my shoulder blades. Those will all turn away from the side I'm turning towards. So if I'm turning my neck towards, if I'm turning my head towards the right, the scales of your spine, things pointing backwards, they turn to the opposite way, the left. And so what that'll do is that will increase the space between my scapula and my spine. If that happens, the muscles like my rhomboids, my middle trap, those will begin to become more eccentric and relax slightly. So now what I have is I've got the space to allow my scapula to move effectively. So I can then get more expansion in between my shoulder blades. Okay. So I've got that aspect to it. Now, when people talk about neck pain, they always focus on muscles. And muscles are very reactive to the position and the shape of the joint. So if I've got somebody whose center of gravity is forward, they've got their shoulder blades squeezed together, they've got this flat T-spine, which is what people call it. Essentially what that is like I have my hand on your back and I shove you forward. And if I shove you forward, your scapulas then get left behind and they will either come towards each other as if you're squeezing your shoulder blades together, or they will come up and over your rib cage. So it looks like you're rounding your shoulders forward. Okay. They will do this because of the change of shape of the spine. And it changes shape of the rib cage. And internally, we've got these big lungs, these big balloons that will also alter the shape of the rib cage. And so neck pain, for the most part, I'm not saying all of them because there's so many different kinds, but you get like neck tension or you get tension in between your shoulder blades. Like that is going to be related to the pressure change. I get more compression in my rib cage. B, the change of shape that occurs because of that. So if I round my shoulders forward, for example, my sternum, my chest gets kind of pulled down, right? So that changes the shape. my scapula come up and over, my arms swing out to the side. And so now I'm limiting motion. So whenever I move my arm, it's as if my whole rib cage is moving together, or I'm using my neck to do it. If you ever see people who don't have a lot of range of motion in their shoulder and they go past their range of motion, they'll kind of side bend their neck towards that side. That's just a way to gain more motion. But so it's the pressure inside, it's the shape of the rib cage that is then going to influence the bones on the outside, which is like our scapula, which is then going to cause certain muscles to get stiff. So our primary objective is to reshape the rib cage, because that's going to put the scapula into a better position. Because if you look at the scapula, inside the scapula is more round. This is more concave, I should say. It's more of like this. It's like a dip inside. And that, therefore, we need a rib cage that's more round to sit on top of it to allow that to happen. If it doesn't, it's going to find an area where it's more round. And that's why it'll come up and over the rib cage, because it's a little bit more round. So yeah, manipulate the pressure inside, change the shape of the rib cage. That is then going to alter the tension relationship. So to recap, my neck is associated with my upper thoracic spine. That movement, the movement from C5 to T5 is what allows me to get end range shoulder flexion. If I don't have that space open, so for example, I'm shrugged up, I'm rounded forward, my shoulder blades are squeezed, so those upper traps are really stiff, or my levator muscle is very stiff, I'm not going to be able to get end range shoulder flexion. So this is why I will use shoulder flexion and turning of the neck as a way to determine what is happening at the rib cage so that I can influence it. If I've got 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, likely my upper part of my rib cage is pretty compressed. So I'm going to have to do things to open it up. One of my favorite things to do is bicep curls, because it will roll the scapula back. And if I turn my head towards the side that I'm doing the bicep curls, look down at my bicep, I will then open up that upper part.
Love that. I love this. I love this.
Yeah. It's a little bit complicated. And like, again, there's a lot of things that you can break down of those things, but it's very different than the thought process of, okay, we just have to relax a muscle, because the muscle is reacting to the joint. So if you just relax a muscle, you're not changing the reason why it's stiff. Do you know what I mean? And so these are the reasons why. Look at everything underneath the muscle and how those are positioned and those are shaped, because it is going to be a reactionary thing to hold things in place. And so if I just relax them, like it's not necessarily addressing the cause, right?
Love this. Love this.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's like all the question I have for today.
Amazing.
So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm primarily currently on Instagram. So my handle is at Alex, my first name, Effer, my last name, Effer. I'm going to be launching a YouTube channel soon so that I can show more things, because there's only a limited amount of time I have on Instagram to be able to demonstrate things. So YouTube kind of removes the time constraint. And then my website, resilientrehab.com. I've got, as I said, my mentorship where I talk about all this stuff so much more in depth. And I've got my upper and lower body programs that are essentially taking these principles and put them into a 9-week or 3-phase exercise program. Again, that is meant to restore range of motion to the shoulders as well as the lower limb based on these principles. So that's kind of where you can find me.
Cool. Appreciate for the time, man. I really love this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate it.